They say Christmas is the season of warmth, of homecoming, of unconditional love and forgiveness. But when you are the designated scapegoat of a family that views you purely as a line of credit, the holidays are nothing more than an annual performance. An exhausting, agonizingly orchestrated play where you are expected to pay for the stage, the lighting, and the props only to be denied a seat in the audience. When I was 42 years old, the only warmth I received on Christmas Eve was the harsh, dry blast of the heater in my sedan as I sat alone in a dark driveway. My holiday gift from my parents wasn't a thoughtfully wrapped present or even a sincere embrace. It was a flimsy, warped plastic container of cold, leftover ham, a door unceremoniously shut in my face, and though I didn't know it yet, a phantom debt of $2 million bearing my forged signature. They thought my silence as I walked out into the freezing Chicago snow was a sign of my eternal, pathetic submission. They assumed I would just swallow the humiliation like I always did, go back to my empty apartment, and continue to be their dutiful ATM. They didn't realize that my silence wasn't surrender. It was the sound of a switch flipping in my brain. It was the quiet, meticulous drafting of their absolute and total ruin. My name is Sailor Mercer. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. To understand how a family can casually discard their eldest daughter into the freezing night, you have to understand the specific suffocating dynamic of the Mercer household. For as long as I can remember, I have been the workhorse. I am a forensic accountant by trade, a senior partner at a top-tier financial firm in downtown Chicago. My entire professional life is dedicated to dissecting the financial anatomies of multi-billion-dollar corporations. I track missing millions, I uncover offshore shell companies, and I expose white-collar criminals who think they are smarter than the paper trail they leave behind. I am paid incredibly well to see the truths that people try to hide in the fine print. Yet, for decades, I was completely, intentionally blind to the emotional and financial fraud happening in my own family. My father, Gideon, is a man who practically breathes vanity. To the outside world, he is a distinguished retired gentleman of the upper middle class, a man who loves golf, expensive scotch, and holding court at the country club. Behind closed doors, he is a covert narcissist whose entire sense of self-worth is tied to an image he could never actually afford. My mother, Tamsin, is his perfect enabler. She is a master of emotional manipulation, a woman who can deliver a soul-crushing insult with a sugary smile and immediately play the victim if you dare to defend yourself. And then there is my younger sister, Harper. Harper is 35, 8 years my junior, and the undeniable, undisputed golden child of the Mercer family. While I was pushed to study, to excel, to become entirely self-sufficient so I wouldn't be a burden, Harper was raised to be an ornament. She is beautiful, charismatic, and entirely allergic to accountability. In my mother's eyes, Harper's mere existence is a triumph. My career, my independence, my financial stability, all of it was viewed by my parents not as an achievement to be proud of, but as a convenient resource pool to maintain their lifestyle and subsidize my sisters. 8 years ago, when I was 35 and Harper was 27, Gideon's fragile house of cards completely collapsed. A series of disastrous, ego-driven investments wiped out his retirement. The bank was 30 days away from foreclosing on the home I grew up in. Tamsin called me, sobbing hysterically, talking about how they would be out on the street, how the humiliation would literally kill my father. I didn't hesitate. I didn't lecture them. I simply did what the eldest daughter is always expected to do. I fixed it. I liquidated a significant portion of my own hard-earned investment portfolio. But I wasn't entirely foolish. Instead of just handing Gideon a blank check, I purchased a stunning, sprawling 5-bedroom colonial home in an affluent, gated community in the Chicago suburbs. I paid in cash. I then established a formal family trust. I placed the deed of the house into the trust, ensuring that my parents could live there rent-free for the rest of their natural lives. I covered the property taxes, the maintenance, and the homeowners association fees. I thought I was buying their security. I thought I was finally buying their genuine love and respect. I was wrong. I had simply upgraded their stage. Over the next 8 years, the colonial house didn't become a place of gratitude. It became a monument to their entitlement. And when Harper married Julian Hayes, the dynamic shifted from toxic to entirely unbearable. Julian is exactly the kind of man my father always wished he was. At 38, Julian is the CEO of a revolutionary tech startup that supposedly merges artificial intelligence with commercial real estate. He speaks almost entirely in Silicon Valley buzzwords: disruption, scalability, synergy. He wears bespoke suits, drives a leased European sports car, and projects an aura of massive, untouchable wealth. My parents were instantly, hopelessly obsessed with him. He was the glittering prize their golden child had won. It never seemed to matter to Gideon and Tamsin that Julian's startup had yet to produce an actual viable product. It didn't matter that Harper hadn't worked a day since she married him. In the Mercer family narrative, Julian and Harper were the triumphant success story, the wealthy elite. I, on the other hand, was just the number cruncher, the spinster sister who lived in a sterile city penthouse. This toxic hierarchy reached its absolute breaking point on the Christmas Eve of my 42nd year. I arrived at the suburban colonial house just as the sun was setting, the sky a bruised purple over the snow-covered manicured lawns. I walked up the salted brick pathway, a pathway I paid to have professionally maintained, and unlocked the heavy mahogany front door. The house smelled of roasting prime rib, cinnamon, and expensive pine. The massive vaulted living room was glowing with the light of a 12-foot tree, but the moment I stepped inside, the emotional temperature plummeted. "Oh, you're here," Tamsin said, emerging from the kitchen. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my tailored, dark wool coat and simple cashmere sweater. "I thought you might dress up a bit this year, Sailor. It's a holiday, not a board meeting. Harper is wearing a stunning silk dress Julian bought her in Milan." "Merry Christmas to you too, Mom," I replied, swallowing the familiar lump in my throat. I handed her a beautifully wrapped gift, an expensive espresso machine she had hinted at for months. She took it without a thank you and set it on a side table as if it were an Amazon delivery. I walked into the living room. Gideon was sitting in his leather armchair, swirling a glass of amber liquid, laughing loudly at something Julian was saying. Julian stood by the fireplace, one arm draped casually over the mantel, holding court. Harper sat on the plush sofa, her legs crossed, a massive diamond catching the firelight. "Sailor!" Julian called out, offering a slick $1,000,000 smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Glad you could make it down from the city. Still grinding away in the corporate trenches?" "Something like that," I said, taking a seat on the edge of a love seat. For the next 3 hours, I endured the dinner from hell. I sat at the grand mahogany dining table, a table I had bought, and watched my family fawn over a man who contributed absolutely nothing to the roof over their heads. Julian's company is about to close a Series B funding round that will completely revolutionize the market, Gideon announced proudly, carving the roast. He looked at Julian with a reverence he had never, not once, shown me. It takes a real visionary to navigate the modern economy, not just someone who counts other people's money. The dig was so blatant, I almost laughed. "I don't just count money, Dad," I said evenly, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "I find out where it's hidden when people lie about it." A brief, strange silence fell over the table. I saw a micro-expression flash across Julian's face, a sudden, sharp tightening of his jaw, a flicker of something that looked dangerously like panic. He quickly masked it with a chuckle, taking a long sip of his wine. Harper shot me a venomous glare. "There's no need to be so defensive and aggressive at the dinner table, Sailor," Tamsin sighed, playing the weary peacemaker. "We are just celebrating your sister's success. Is it so hard for you to be happy for her for one night?" "I am happy for her," I said, though the food in my mouth had turned to ash. The real blow didn't come until the dinner was cleared and we were standing in the grand foyer. I had planned to spend the night in my usual guest room, to wake up on Christmas morning and watch them open the expensive gifts I had meticulously chosen for them. Instead, Tamsin walked up to me, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, wearing her signature mask of faux apology. "Sailor, darling," she began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "There's been a slight change of plans for the sleeping arrangements tonight." I frowned, zipping up my coat. "What do you mean?" "Well," Tamsin said, glancing nervously toward the living room where Julian and Gideon were talking. "Julian's parents are flying in from Boston tomorrow morning. Their hotel reservation got completely messed up and Julian simply insisted they stay here with us. They are high society people, Sailor. They expect a certain level of hospitality." "Okay," I said slowly. "The house has 5 bedrooms. There's the master, Harper and Julian's room, my room, and 2 empty guest rooms." "Yes, but Julian's parents require the ensuite," Tamsin explained, her tone hardening just a fraction. Your room is the only guest room with the attached bath. We need to put them in there, and we're turning the other rooms into a dressing area and a luggage space for them. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. So, where am I supposed to sleep? The couch? Oh, don't be dramatic, Tamsin scoffed, rolling her eyes. Julian's parents are very traditional. They might find it awkward to have you sleeping in the living room like a teenager. Plus, they want to discuss some private family trust matters regarding their future grandchildren. She reached out and patted my arm, a touch that felt like ice. You're so independent, Sailor. You have that beautiful apartment in the city. You don't mind driving back, do you? You're strong. You always handle things on your own. She was kicking me out. On Christmas Eve, from the house I bought, paid for, and maintained so her son-in-law's parents wouldn't feel awkward. Before I could even formulate a response, Tamsin reached over to the marble console table. She picked up a cheap, flimsy plastic container, the kind you get from a cheap takeout restaurant. The lid wasn't even snapped on correctly. She shoved it directly into my hands. Here, she said dismissively. I packed you some of the leftover ham and some potatoes. Eat it at your apartment. Have a Merry Christmas, sweetie. Drive safe. She didn't wait for me to say goodbye to my father. She didn't offer a hug. She simply stepped back, offered one last tight, practiced smile, and gently pushed the heavy mahogany door shut in my face. The loud, metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the freezing night air. I stood on the snow-covered porch for a long time. The wind howled through the bare branches of the oak trees, biting through my wool coat, freezing the moisture in my eyes. Any other daughter might have broken down right there. Any other person might have pounded their fists against the solid wood, demanding to be let in, screaming for the basic, fundamental warmth of a family. But I didn't cry. I looked down at the plastic container in my hands. Through the frosted plastic, I could see the scraps of meat, congealing in a layer of cold fat. It wasn't just a container of leftovers. It was a physical manifestation of exactly what I meant to them. An afterthought, a nuisance, a discardable utility. I turned around and carefully navigated the icy, salted walkway back to my sedan parked in the long driveway. When I climbed inside, the leather seats were stiff with cold. I started the engine, blasting the heat to its highest setting. I sat there under the amber glow of the street lamp, the engine idling in the silent, affluent neighborhood. I popped the warped lid off the plastic container. I was freezing and my stomach was painfully empty. I used a plastic fork from my glove compartment and took a bite of the cold, stiff potatoes. They tasted like 35 years of resentment. They tasted like every ignored birthday, every unacknowledged promotion, every dollar I had bled to keep a roof over the heads of people who couldn't even stand to look at me. As I sat there, eating my cold Christmas dinner in the driver's seat of my car, the hurt began to recede. The profound, agonizing pain of an unloved child was suddenly, violently eclipsed by something else. A cold, sharp, terrifying clarity settled over me, as crisp and unforgiving as the Chicago winter air. The forensic accountant inside me woke up. I thought about the micro-expression of panic on Julian's face when I mentioned finding hidden money. I thought about the sheer audacity of my parents kicking the legal owner of the property out into the snow. People who are financially secure don't act with such desperate, manic devotion to a son-in-law unless they are terrified of losing him. And Julian Hayes did not look like a man leading a successful Series B funding round. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor. I set the half-empty container on the passenger seat. I didn't drive back to my warm penthouse to cry myself to sleep. I drove back to the city, walked directly into my home office, and booted up my encrypted laptop. They had just shown me exactly who they were. They had drawn the battle lines in the snow. They believed I was just a quiet, obedient bank account they could drain and discard at will. It was time to audit the Mercer family, and I was going to account for every single penny. Christmas morning in a downtown Chicago penthouse is a masterclass in absolute silence. When you live on the 42nd floor, you don't hear the snowplows scraping the asphalt or the muffled sounds of children playing in the drifts. You only hear the low, steady hum of the climate control and the occasional whistle of the wind throwing itself against the floor-to-ceiling glass. I woke up at 6 in the morning. I hadn't slept for more than 45 minutes at a time. My phone rested on the marble nightstand, its screen completely dark. No missed calls, no Merry Christmas text from my mother. No apologies from my father for kicking me out into the sub-zero temperatures. To them, the incident was already over. I had been dismissed, and my role was to quietly process the rejection and return with my checkbook whenever they deemed it necessary. I walked into my kitchen, brewed a pot of black coffee, and carried the steaming mug into my home office. My office was my sanctuary. It was dominated by a massive oak desk and a custom-built workstation with 3 high-resolution monitors. This was the command center where I dismantled corporate frauds and traced billions of dollars across international borders. It was time to point that heavily calibrated weaponry at my own family. I sat down, the leather chair cool against my skin, and woke up the screens. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. As a forensic accountant, my first rule is simple. People lie, but numbers don't. Documents don't have egos. They don't gaslight you. They leave a trail, and if you know exactly where to look, you can rebuild any crime scene from the ground up. I logged into my secure VPN and bypassed my personal banking portals, navigating directly to the Cook County Clerk's online public records database. 8 years ago, I had established the Mercer Family Trust in good faith. I had legally structured it so that I was the grantor and my parents were the lifetime beneficiaries. The trust owned the suburban colonial house free and clear. It was supposed to be an impenetrable fortress of financial security for their old age. I typed the exact parcel identification number of the property into the search bar. The system buffered for a few seconds, an agonizing pause, before populating a chronological list of every recorded document attached to that address. I scrolled past the original deed of sale from 8 years ago. I scrolled past the document transferring the property into the family trust. Then, my eyes locked onto a filing from exactly 14 months ago. My breath caught in my throat. The coffee mug in my hand trembled slightly, splashing a hot drop of dark liquid onto my wrist. But I didn't feel the burn. The document was labeled Quitclaim Deed. 14 months ago, the colonial house had been officially transferred out of the Mercer Family Trust and back into my personal name as a sole proprietor, but I had never authorized that transfer. I had never signed a quitclaim deed. Why would the house be pulled out of the trust protection? I didn't have to wait long for the answer. I clicked on the very next document, filed a mere 48 hours after the fraudulent quitclaim deed. It was a commercial deed of trust and security agreement. I paid the standard municipal fee with my credit card and downloaded the full 60-page PDF. I dragged the document to my center monitor and zoomed in. My eyes darted across the dense, legally binding jargon, my professional training taking over to translate the catastrophic reality of what I was looking at. Someone had used the suburban house, my house, as collateral to secure a massive commercial loan. I scrolled down to the principal amount. $2 million. $2 million. They had pulled $2 million of raw equity and hard cash out of the property. But the horrifying part wasn't just the sheer amount. It was the mechanism of the fraud. To take out a commercial mortgage on a property solely in my name, the lender would require my physical presence, my government ID, and my notarized signature. I aggressively scrolled to the signature pages at the bottom of the PDF. I expected to see Julian's name. I assumed my slick, charismatic brother-in-law had somehow conned a corrupt notary and forged my signature to fund his failing tech startup. Julian was the grifter. Julian was the obvious suspect. But when I reached the final page, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. It wasn't Julian's name attached to the authorization. Attached to the commercial loan was a secondary document, a general power of attorney. A power of attorney is a devastatingly powerful legal instrument. It grants someone else the absolute legal right to act on your behalf in all financial and real estate matters. According to this document, I had allegedly granted full, unrestricted power of attorney to a single individual, allowing them to sign the $2 million loan documents in my absence. I stared at the name listed as my designated legal agent, Gideon Mercer, my father. I zoomed in to 300% on the signature line of the power of attorney. There was my name, Sailor Mercer, signed in blue ink, but it wasn't my signature. The loop on the S was entirely wrong, too aggressive and wide. The slant of the Y lacked my usual sharp, fluid cursive. It was a forgery. But it wasn't a stranger's forgery. I knew that heavy-handed, blocky cursive. I had seen it on thousands of birthday cards, on my childhood report cards, on checks. It was Gideon's handwriting. My own father had forged my signature to grant himself absolute control over my financial identity. He had pulled my house out of the family trust, put it in my name, and then used his fake power of attorney to mortgage it to the hilt. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the penthouse suddenly deafening. The betrayal was so profound, so mathematically calculated, that my brain initially refused to process it. I had spent the last 8 years believing my father was just a harmless, arrogant man who liked to project wealth. I didn't realize he was a man willing to commit a Class 2 federal felony to steal from his own daughter. But why? Gideon didn't have a business to fund. Why take out $2 million? I cross-referenced the beneficiary routing information listed on the loan disbursement page. The $2 million hadn't gone into Gideon's personal checking account. The money had been wired directly to a corporate holding account registered under the name Oraprop Innovations, LLC, Julian's tech startup. The sickening, twisted psychology of my family's dynamics suddenly snapped into crystal clear focus. Gideon hadn't just allowed Julian to steal from me. Gideon was the mastermind. Gideon had orchestrated the entire fraud. He had risked my property, my credit, and my legal freedom to act as the angel investor for his golden son-in-law. Gideon needed to feel like the patriarch. He couldn't stand the fact that his spinster daughter had bailed him out of bankruptcy. It bruised his fragile, narcissistic ego every single day he woke up under a roof I had paid for. So he stole the equity of that very roof and handed it to Julian. By funding Julian's company, Gideon got to play the role of the wealthy kingmaker. He got to look at Julian and say, "I built your empire." They had stolen my money to finance the illusion of their own superiority. For 2 days, I didn't leave my apartment. I didn't answer my phone. I didn't sleep. I fell into a fugue state of pure, unadulterated forensic analysis. I pulled every public tax record, every corporate filing associated with Oraprop Innovations, and every UCC financing statement I could legally access. I was building a comprehensive dossier of their crimes. By the morning of December 28th, I was ready. I needed to see their faces. I needed to hear their justifications. I needed to look into the eyes of the people who had raised me and see if there was a single shred of remorse left in their souls. I picked up my phone and sent a brief, carefully worded text to Tamsin. "Mom, I know Christmas ended poorly. I'd like to take you and Dad out to lunch downtown today to clear the air. My treat. The Dearborn, 1 p.m. The reply came back less than 3 minutes later. "We would love that, Sailor. It's very mature of you to apologize. See you at 1. Mature of me to apologize. I stared at the text, feeling a dark, cold smile creep across my face. The Dearborn is an upscale, elegant restaurant in the heart of Chicago's Loop, heavily trafficked by corporate executives and politicians. It is exactly the kind of place Gideon loves because it makes him feel important. When I arrived, they were already seated at a quiet corner booth. Gideon was wearing a cashmere sport coat, and Tamsin had draped a designer silk scarf around her neck. They looked like the picture-perfect, affluent American couple. I slid into the booth across from them. "Sailor, darling," Tamsin said, reaching across the table to briefly squeeze my hand. "We are so glad you called. We were quite worried about you driving back in that snowstorm, but your father said you're tough as nails." "I survived," I said, my voice completely flat. I ordered a glass of sparkling water. Gideon ordered a $25 glass of Macallan. We made shallow, meaningless small talk until the waiter cleared our appetizers. I watched them eat. I watched them smile. There was no guilt in their posture, no nervous ticking. They were completely and utterly at peace with what they had done to me. I folded my hands on the pristine white tablecloth. It was time to pull the pin on the grenade. "I've been reviewing my financial portfolios for the end of the year," I said casually, keeping my tone light, almost conversational. "And I've decided to make some major structural changes. I'm going to liquidate a few assets, including the Colonial House." Gideon's glass of scotch stopped halfway to his mouth. Tamsin's fork, carrying a piece of seared scallop, froze in midair. The physical reaction was instantaneous. The blood drained from Gideon's face, leaving his complexion a sickly, mottled gray. What do you mean, liquidate?" Gideon asked, his voice suddenly losing its booming, authoritative resonance. "I mean, I'm going to sell the house, Dad," I said, looking him dead in the eyes. "The real estate market in the suburbs is peaking. I can pull a massive amount of equity out of the property right now. I've already contacted a broker to list it next week. You and Mom will have 30 days to relocate. I'll help you find a nice, affordable rental apartment." For a span of 5 seconds, neither of them breathed. They looked at each other, sheer, unadulterated panic transmitting between them in a rapid, silent frequency. They knew exactly why I couldn't sell the house. If I tried to list the property, the title search would immediately red flag the $2 million commercial lien. The forgery would be exposed. "You can't do that," Gideon blurted out, slamming his heavy crystal glass onto the table. "You absolutely cannot sell that house, Sailor." "Why not?" I tilted my head, perfectly feigning innocent confusion. "I bought it. It's in the family trust. I'm the grantor. I have the legal right to dissolve the trust and sell the asset." Tamsin leaned forward, her eyes wide, shifting instantly into her defensive, manipulative persona. "Sailor, you are being incredibly selfish and impulsive. That is our home. We have established our lives there. You can't just throw your elderly parents out on the street to make a quick profit. What about our bridge club? What about Harper? She and Julian bring the baby over every weekend." "Harper and Julian can host you at their place," I replied smoothly. "After all, Julian is closing a massive Series B funding round, right? He's practically a tech billionaire. He can buy you a much nicer house than I ever could." Gideon's jaw clenched. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar. He realized he was backed into a corner, and a narcissist in a corner will always resort to their favorite weapon: aggressive, unapologetic justification. He leaned across the table, invading my personal space, dropping his voice to a harsh, commanding whisper. "You are not selling the house, Sailor, because the equity is already gone," Gideon hissed, his eyes burning with a terrifying mix of anger and entitlement. I let my expression drop. The faux innocence vanished. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," Gideon snapped, his chest puffing out as if he were taking pride in his confession. "I restructured the family assets 14 months ago. I took a loan against the property to provide seed capital for Julian's company." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch, forcing him to sit in the reality of his own words. "You took a loan against my property, without my permission. You forged a power of attorney to steal $2 million from me." "Oh, please, stop using such ugly, dramatic words like steal and forge," Tamsin interjected, waving her hand dismissively as if I had just complained about a bad haircut. "Your father didn't steal anything. He is the head of this family. He made an executive financial decision for the greater good of our legacy." I looked at my mother, genuinely marveling at the depth of her delusion. "He committed a federal crime, Mom. That's not an executive decision. That's real estate fraud." "It's family money, Sailor," Gideon interrupted, his voice rising, drawing a quick glance from a waiter nearby. He lowered his volume but doubled down on the venom. "You have millions sitting in mutual funds doing absolutely nothing. You are a single woman with no children and no legacy. Julian is building an empire. He needed liquid capital to scale his operations. In 3 years, that company will go public and he'll pay off that loan 10 times over. I did what I had to do because I knew you would be too stubborn and tight-fisted to see the vision." The sheer audacity was breathtaking. He had robbed me blind, and he was angry at me for not appreciating his criminal ingenuity. "You risked my entire financial future," I said, my voice dropping to a low clinical register. "If Julian defaults on that commercial loan, the bank won't just take the house. They will come after me. My name is on the paperwork. They will garnish my wages, destroy my credit, and potentially drag me into a criminal investigation for bank fraud." "Julian is not going to default," Tamsin snapped, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. "Julian is a brilliant businessman. The only problem here is your jealousy, Sailor. You have always been so utterly jealous of Harper. You can't stand that she found a wonderful, successful man while you sit alone in your cold apartment counting numbers. You are a bitter, calculating spinster, and your father simply made sure your hoarded wealth actually benefited this family for once." I sat perfectly still. The ambient noise of the upscale restaurant, the clinking of silverware, the soft jazz, the murmur of wealthy patrons seemed to fade away, leaving only a vacuum of absolute silence in my mind. I looked at my father, who was glaring at me with self-righteous fury. I looked at my mother, whose face was contoured with pure, unadulterated disdain. For 35 years, I had held on to a desperate, pathetic hope. I thought that if I just achieved enough, if I paid enough bills, if I solved enough of their problems, they would eventually look at me the way they looked at Harper. I thought I could buy my way into their hearts. But as I sat in that booth, absorbing my mother's cruel, venomous words, the final, fraying thread of my familial love violently snapped. The woman who walked into that restaurant was Sailor Mercer, the unloved, desperate daughter. The woman who remained sitting in that booth was something entirely different. The trauma response faded. entirely replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a forensic auditor who had just found a fatal discrepancy in the ledger. They didn't see me as a human being. I was just a line item on their balance sheet. And in the world of finance, when an asset becomes a toxic liability, you don't cry over it. You cut it loose. You liquidate it. You destroy it before it destroys you. "You're right, Mom," I said softly. My voice was completely void of emotion, calm and smooth like polished glass. Tamsin blinked, slightly thrown by my sudden lack of resistance. I'm glad you finally see reason, Sailor." "I see exactly what this is," I said, reaching into my designer handbag. I pulled out a crisp $100 bill and laid it carefully on the table to cover my sparkling water and Gideon's scotch. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I looked down at the two people who had brought me into this world, feeling nothing but a profound clinical detachment. They were no longer my parents. They were the targets of an audit. "Enjoy the lunch," I said, my tone perfectly polite. "I have to get back to the office. I have a lot of numbers to crunch." "Sailor," Gideon said, a slight edge of apprehension creeping back into his voice as I turned to leave. "We are clear on this, right? You keep your mouth shut and you leave the house alone. Julian has everything under control." I looked back over my shoulder, offering them a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Oh, I'm not going to sell the house, Dad," I promised softly. "You have my word." I walked out of the restaurant, the heavy glass doors closing behind me, stepping back out into the freezing Chicago afternoon. I pulled my wool coat tight against the wind, my mind already moving 10 steps ahead, laying out the complex legal architecture of their impending doom. I wasn't going to sell the house. I wasn't going to call the police and report the forgery either. That would be entirely too easy. That would just result in a messy family court battle, a slap on the wrist for Gideon, and Julian playing the victim of his father-in-law's overzealousness. No, they had played a high-stakes financial game using my name, and they had arrogantly assumed I wouldn't know the rules. They were about to find out that I wrote the rulebook. I was going to dig into the shadowy origins of that $2 million loan. I was going to rip Julian's fake tech startup apart piece by piece. I was going to track every single stolen dollar, and when I finally pulled the thread, I was going to watch their entire lives unravel. The audit had officially begun. The psychological shift from victim to predator is not a loud cinematic event. It doesn't happen with a scream or a shattered mirror. It happens in the absolute terrifying quiet of a hyper-focused mind. When I walked out of the Dearborn restaurant, leaving my parents to finish their expensive scotch and seared scallops, I didn't feel a shred of the devastating heartbreak that had paralyzed me on Christmas Eve. That sailor was dead. The woman walking down the icy pavement of Michigan Avenue was a machine, running on the high-octane fuel of cold, forensic calculation. My first stop was not the police station. If you walk into a federal precinct with a forged deed, you become a victim waiting in line. The government freezes the asset, ties the property up in a bureaucratic nightmare for half a decade, and leaves you to pay the legal fees while the criminals post bail and hide their assets. I had no intention of letting the justice system dictate the pace of my retribution. I wanted total annihilation, and for that, I needed a very specific kind of architect. I needed Elias Thorne. Elias was a senior partner at a boutique financial law firm that catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy and the hyper-paranoid. He was a man in his late 60s, perpetually dressed in impeccable Tom Ford suits, with a mind like a steel trap and a moral compass that pointed strictly toward his client's best interests. Elias didn't just practice corporate law. He wielded it like a scalpel in a dark alley. We had collaborated on several massive corporate fraud cases over the years, dismantling corrupt CEOs piece by piece. I walked into his mahogany-paneled office on the 55th floor of the Willis Tower and dropped a thick, encrypted flash drive onto his pristine desk. "Elias," I said, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite him, "I need you to pull a full corporate background check, shadow banking history, and UCC lien search on a company called Aura Prop Innovations. And I need the raw data on a commercial loan attached to my personal residential property in the suburbs." Elias paused, setting down his gold fountain pen. He looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses, his sharp blue eyes instantly registering the absolute lack of warmth in my voice. He plugged the drive into his secure terminal and typed for a few minutes. When the files opened on his screen, the silence in the room grew heavy. I watched his eyes scan the digitized pages of the forged power of attorney and the $2 million commercial deed of trust. Elias was a man who rarely showed emotion, but a deep, dangerous frown carved its way into his forehead. "Sailor," Elias began, his voice a low, gravelly baritone, "this is a Class 2 felony. Someone forged a general power of attorney to pull $2 million in raw equity out of your colonial property. The signature is an amateur tracing job. If we take this to the district attorney right now, whoever did this is looking at a mandatory minimum of 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary." "I know exactly who did it," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "My father." Elias stopped. He looked up at me, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in his razor-sharp mind. "Gideon, he took the equity to fund a shell company?" "He took it to fund my brother-in-law's tech startup, Auraprop Innovations. He played angel investor with my credit." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on his desk. "But I'm not going to the DA, not yet. I want to know exactly where that $2 million came from. Traditional banks don't hand out that kind of cash to a pre-revenue tech startup based on a single piece of residential collateral without an aggressive underwriting process. Who approved the loan?" Elias turned back to his monitors. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the public abstracts and digging directly into the proprietary financial databases his firm paid millions to access. "You're right. It wasn't a traditional bank," Elias murmured, his eyes reflecting the harsh glare of the screen. "Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, none of them would touch a tech startup with residential collateral without the primary guarantor. You, sitting in the room. They went to the secondary market, the shadow market." He clicked a final button and printed a document. He slid the warm paper across the desk to me. At the top of the page, in bold, aggressive lettering, was a logo I recognized instantly, and it made the blood in my veins run ice cold. Sterling Holdings. "Julian didn't just take out a loan," Elias said grimly, leaning back in his chair. "He got into bed with Victor Sterling. This was the first massive twist in the tangled web my family had woven, and it was infinitely more dangerous than I could have ever anticipated. Sterling Holdings was not a bank. They were a private equity and mezzanine debt firm. In the financial sector, they were known as corporate vultures. Victor Sterling operated in the murky, unregulated gray areas of commercial lending. He loaned money to desperate people, developers facing bankruptcy, startups bleeding cash, individuals too dirty for traditional finance. And he didn't charge normal interest rates. Sterling's loans were predatory, packed with hidden clauses, balloon payments, and exorbitant default penalties. But the most terrifying thing about Victor Sterling wasn't his interest rates. It was his collection methods. If you defaulted on a Sterling loan, they didn't just politely foreclose on your house. They unleashed an army of ruthless litigators who would seize every asset, freeze your bank accounts, and criminally prosecute anyone attached to the paperwork for the slightest discrepancy. "Look at the terms, sailor." Elias pointed a manicured finger at the paper. 18% annual interest. Mandatory monthly interest-only payments of $30,000 just to keep the loan out of default, and a full balloon payment of the $2 million principal due in 36 months. I stared at the numbers, the terrifying reality washing over me. It's a financial death trap. "It's worse than that," Elias corrected softly. "Sailor, your name is on the paper. Gideon used the fake power of attorney to make you the primary guarantor. Victor Sterling doesn't care that your signature was forged. If Auraprop Innovations defaults on these monthly payments, Sterling's lawyers will come after you. They will put a lien on your penthouse. They will garnish your corporate salary. They will drag your name through the mud until you are forced to pay them the $2 million just to make them stop. Gideon didn't just steal from you. He handed Victor Sterling a loaded gun and pointed it directly at your head." I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. My father, in his pathetic, desperate need to play the wealthy patriarch, had practically sold me to a financial syndicate. If Julian's startup went under, I would be the one buried in the wreckage. "We need to go to the FBI, sailor," Elias urged, his tone shifting from professional to fiercely protective. "We file a fraud affidavit today. We cut you out of this before Julian misses a payment." "No." I opened my eyes. They were hard, completely devoid of fear. If we go to the FBI, the government seizes the house as evidence. It gets tied up in a criminal probe. My parents get a slap on the wrist for wire fraud, and Julian plays the victim of a predatory lender. That is not justice, Elias. That is a bailout. Then what do you want to do? I want to know exactly how much time I have before the bomb goes off, I said, standing up. I need to look inside Aura Prop Innovations. I need to see their books. I need to know when Julian is going to run out of Victor Sterling's money. They are a private LLC, Sailor. You can't just ask for their ledger, and hacking them is a federal offense. I don't need to hack them, Etta replied, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. Gideon is an investor. He loves to brag. He's sloppy. I left Elias's office and returned to my penthouse. I had one goal: breach the walls of Julian's golden empire. Julian Hayes projected the image of a tech visionary, but my instincts told me he was nothing more than a charismatic con artist running a high-end shell game. I sat at my workstation and pulled up the public-facing website for Aura Prop Innovations. It was a masterpiece of empty corporate jargon. Beautiful, sleek stock footage of futuristic cities, bold claims about AI-driven real estate valuation, but absolutely zero details about an actual working product. I clicked on the investor portal login at the bottom of the screen. My father was a creature of intense, predictable habit. He used the same password for his country club account, his Golf Digest subscription, and his banking app. It was a manifestation of his ego. I typed in his email address. For the password, I typed GideonM_1956. The screen buffered for a second, then it flashed green. Welcome, Gideon Mercer, Executive Angel Investor. I was inside. The back end of the investor portal was a completely different world from the glossy front page. It was a digital graveyard of panicked financial updates, delayed product launches, and desperate pleas for more capital. I downloaded the quarterly cash flow statements, the expense reports, and the internal memos. It took me less than an hour to piece together the forensic anatomy of Julian's company. It wasn't a tech startup, it was a textbook Ponzi scheme. Aura Prop Innovations had no proprietary AI software. They had no real estate algorithm. The $2 million Gideon had stolen from my house equity had not gone into research and development. It had gone straight into Julian's lifestyle. I tracked the outbound wire transfers. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on leasing a luxury office space downtown to project success. Tens of thousands spent on the leased European sports car, first-class flights to investor summits in Dubai, and, sickeningly, a $50,000 charge at a high-end Milanese boutique, the exact boutique where Harper's Christmas dress was purchased. Julian was burning through Victor Sterling's high-interest loan at a catastrophic rate, using the principal to pay his exorbitant salary and keeping up the illusion of wealth to lure in new, smaller investors to pay the monthly interest to Sterling. The classic shell game. But the money was running out. Fast. According to the internal ledger, Aura Prop had less than $80,000 in liquid cash remaining. At $30,000 a month for Sterling's interest payments, plus the ridiculous office overhead, Julian would officially default in less than 60 days. 60 days until Victor Sterling unleashed his lawyers. 60 days until the Shadow Syndicate came to seize my house and destroy my life. I kept digging through the portal, looking for a corporate directory. I needed to see who else was complicit in this fraud. Julian couldn't manage a Ponzi scheme of this magnitude alone. He needed someone balancing the fake books, someone actively managing the wire transfers to keep the shell companies afloat. I opened the internal Slack logs and the corporate email archives attached to the portal's administrative view. I filtered the searches by financial keywords: wire transfer, Sterling, deed. A specific email thread populated on my screen. It was dated 14 months ago, the exact week my house was pulled from the family trust and the fake power of attorney was filed. The email was sent from Julian to someone designated only by the initial H. Julian. Victor needs the collateral finalized by Friday or he pulls the $2 million term sheet. Gideon is dragging his feet. He's too nervous about the notary. We need Sailor's signature on the POA immediately. I scrolled down to read the reply from H. As my eyes scanned the text, the air in the room seemed to evaporate. H. Dad's hand shakes too much when he's anxious. He'll ruin the slant. Don't worry, I've got it. I pulled Sailor's old college applications from the attic boxes. I traced her signature 50 times on a legal pad. I have the loop on the S down perfectly. I'll sign the power of attorney tonight and stamp it with the notary we paid off in the loop. Just make sure the wire hits our account by Monday. I need to clear the credit card before my Milan trip." I sat frozen, staring at the glowing monitor. H. Harper. This was the second devastating twist, a knife twisted so deeply into my back that it severed any remaining emotional tie I had to my family. Gideon hadn't acted alone. Julian wasn't a solo mastermind. It was a family syndicate. My beautiful, innocent, golden child sister. The woman who sat on the sofa on Christmas Eve flaunting her diamonds and looking down on my corporate trench lifestyle was the shadow chief financial officer of a criminal enterprise. Harper wasn't a clueless housewife blindly enjoying her husband's success. She was the one actively falsifying the financial reports. She was the one managing the stolen money. And most unforgivably, Harper was the one who had physically held the pen. She had traced my signature. She had weaponized her access to my childhood documents to steal my identity. Her jealousy of my independence, her insatiable greed, and her absolute lack of a moral compass had allowed her to literally sign away my financial freedom so she could buy designer dresses in Milan. She had stolen my name. A slow, terrifyingly calm sensation washed over me. It was the absolute absence of grief. My father had betrayed me out of ego. My mother had enabled it out of delusion. But Harper had orchestrated it out of pure, malicious envy. They had all sat around that beautiful dining room table on Christmas Eve, eating a roast I paid for, inside a house I bought, fully aware that they had mortgaged my future to a shadow syndicate, and then they had handed me a plastic tub of cold leftovers and kicked me out into the snow. I reached out and gently closed the laptop screen. They thought I was just a rigid, boring accountant. They thought my adherence to the rules made me weak, predictable, and easily manipulated. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my profession. A forensic accountant doesn't just read the rules. We know every single loophole, every blind spot, and every fatal flaw in the system. We know how to dismantle a corporation so thoroughly that not even the ash remains. I picked up my phone and dialed Elias Thorne. He answered on the first ring. "Elias," I said, my voice echoing in the silent penthouse. "I found the ledger. They have less than 60 days of liquidity before they default on Victor Sterling's loan. But we aren't going to the FBI, and we aren't going to wait for Sterling to come after me." "What is your play, sailor?" Elias asked, sensing the dangerous shift in my tone. "Victor Sterling is a vulture capitalist. He doesn't care about the real estate. He cares about liquidity and yield. If a loan is about to go toxic, he will offload it to a secondary buyer at a discount just to clear it from his books." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering, freezing skyline of Chicago. "I want you to set up a blind offshore shell company. Cayman Islands, Delaware LLC layer, total anonymity." "Done," Elias said instantly. "And then?" "And then," I smiled, a predator showing its teeth in the dark, "you are going to contact Victor Sterling. You are going to tell him that an anonymous private equity group knows Oraprop Innovations is a Ponzi scheme on the verge of default, and you are going to offer to buy the $2 million debt off his hands right now, in cash, at a 20% discount." Elias was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, there was a profound, chilling respect in his voice. "Sailor, if you buy that debt through a blind shell company..." "Exactly," I whispered. I wasn't going to sue my family. I wasn't going to report them. I was going to become their bank. I was going to own to buy their debt. I was going to own the explosive device they had strapped to my chest, and I was going to hold the detonator. When Julian inevitably defaulted, he wouldn't be answering to Victor Sterling. He, Harper, and my parents would be answering to a faceless, merciless corporate entity that had the absolute legal right to seize every single asset they possessed, liquidate their lives, and send them to federal prison. They would be answering to me. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for them to walk willingly into the slaughterhouse. In the high-stakes world of corporate finance, there is a fundamental rule about toxic debt. Whoever holds the paper controls the execution. Debt is not just a number on a ledger. It is a living, breathing weapon. When you owe a bank $10,000, you have a problem. When you owe a bank $2 million, the bank has a problem. But when you owe $2 million to a predator and that predator suddenly sells your debt to an invisible, faceless entity, you don't just have a problem. You have a countdown to your own funeral. The execution of my plan required absolute clinical precision. I couldn't simply buy the commercial loan under my own name. If Julian or my father saw Sailor Mercer listed as the new lien holder, they would instantly realize they were caught. They would panic, hire defense attorneys, and try to preemptively tie the house up in a prolonged familial civil suit. I needed them to remain entirely blind. I needed them to believe they were still playing their arrogant little game, completely unaware that the board had been flipped. I sat in Elias Thorne's office on the 55th floor, watching the winter sun bleed over the Chicago skyline. Elias sat across from me, a secure conference line actively dialing out on his massive mahogany desk. "We are establishing a Delaware Series LLC," Elias explained, his voice smooth and entirely professional. "We're calling it Acheron Financial. In Greek mythology, Acheron is the river of woe, the river the dead must cross. I thought it was fitting." I offered a small, humorless smile. "It's perfect. Does Victor Sterling suspect anything?" Victor Sterling is a vulture sailor. He operates on risk algorithms and liquidity. Right now, Oraprop Innovations is a blip on his radar, but I took the liberty of adjusting his perspective. Elias adjusted his cuffs, his eyes glinting with predatory intelligence. I made a few anonymous, untraceable calls to a couple of his junior analysts. I dropped some heavy hints about Julian's burn rate and the complete lack of proprietary AI tech. Sterling's algorithms are now flashing bright red. He knows Oraprop is a sinking ship. If we offer him an immediate exit, he'll take the cash rather than spend the next 2 years paying litigators to foreclose on a suburban house. The speakerphone chimed, and a deep, aggressively gravelly voice filled the room. "Thorne!" Victor Sterling barked, skipping any pleasantries. "My analysts tell me you represent a blind private equity group interested in acquiring the paper on the Oraprop Innovations portfolio." "That is correct, Victor," Elias said smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair. "My clients specialize in distressed assets. They are willing to assume the risk on the $2 million commercial loan backed by the residential collateral in the Illinois suburbs. But given the highly unstable nature of the debtor's tech startup, they are not paying face value." "The loan is performing," Sterling shot back defensively. "Hayes hasn't missed a $30,000 interest payment yet." "He hasn't missed one yet," Elias corrected softly. "But my clients have done their due diligence. Oraprop has less than 60 days of runway before the Ponzi collapses. When that happens, you're looking at a messy, protracted foreclosure on a single-family home with a primary guarantor who will likely claim fraud. You don't want that headache, Victor. My clients will take the paper off your hands right now, $1.6 million in cash, wired to your holding account within the hour." Sterling was silent. He was calculating the math. Taking an immediate $400,000 haircut stung his pride, but guaranteed liquidity on a toxic asset was the holy grail of shadow banking. 1.75, Sterling grunted, "and you take all legal liability for the collateral transfer." "Done," Elias said instantly. The line went dead. Elias looked up at me, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. I authorized the wire transfer from my most heavily guarded investment portfolio. It was a massive sum of liquid cash, a staggering amount of money to move in a single afternoon. But I wasn't spending it. I was investing in the absolute, undeniable destruction of the people who had tried to ruin me. Within 48 hours, the legal paperwork was finalized, signed, and encrypted. Victor Sterling formally transferred the promissory note, the commercial deed of trust, and the fraudulent general power of attorney to Acheron Financial, LLC. I was now holding the paper. I was the bank. I was the executioner. But I didn't want to just sit back and wait for the 60 days to expire. I wanted to watch them sweat. I wanted to see the cracks form in the golden facade my parents worshipped so blindly. I returned to my penthouse workstation and initiated Phase 2. To break a Ponzi scheme, you don't attack the founder. You attack the foundation. Julian was using the dwindling loan money to pay early investors their returns, keeping them quiet while he hunted for fresh victims. If even one of those early investors demanded their full principal back, the entire house of cards would violently implode. Using an encrypted, untraceable email server routed through 3 different countries, I sent a highly detailed, anonymous tip to Julian's second largest angel investor, a retired dentist in the suburbs who had handed Julian $400,000 from his pension fund. I didn't make wild accusations. I simply provided a screenshot of Oraprop's true liquid cash balance and a heavily redacted copy of the commercial loan terms. I hit send, and then I watched the dominoes fall. It took exactly 3 days for the panic to set in. I was sitting in my office on a Tuesday morning when my personal cell phone buzzed. It was Tamsin. I let it ring 4 times before sliding my finger across the screen. "Hello, Mom," I said, my voice projecting nothing but mild, distracted politeness. "Sailor," Tamsin said, her voice tight, vibrating with a nervous energy she was desperately trying to conceal. "How are you, darling? We haven't heard from you since our lovely lunch downtown." "I've been busy," I replied. "Corporate audits take up a lot of time. Is everything okay?" "Oh, everything is fine. Just fine," she lied seamlessly. "It's just, Julian is under an immense amount of pressure right now. His brilliance is really taking a toll on him. One of his minor investors is being incredibly difficult, demanding an early withdrawal just before the Series B funding closes. It's causing a slight liquidity bottleneck. The stress is really affecting Harper. Liquidity bottleneck. That was Julian's buzzword. He was bleeding out, and he was feeding my parents' corporate jargon to mask the hemorrhage. The retired dentist had panicked and pulled his money. Julian had been forced to drain the absolute last of Victor Sterling's loan money to pay the man off and keep him from going to the SEC. Oraprop Innovations didn't have 60 days anymore. They had less than 14. "That sounds stressful," I said, feigning mild sympathy. "But Julian is a visionary, right? I'm sure he has everything under control." "Well, yes, of course," Tamsin stammered, clearly frustrated that I wasn't offering to open my checkbook. "But your father and I were thinking, since you are doing so well, maybe you might want to consider investing? Just a short-term bridge loan to your brother-in-law? You have all that money sitting around, Sailor. It would practically be a guaranteed return." I almost laughed out loud. The sheer, breathtaking audacity. They had already stolen $2 million from my house, and now they were sending my mother to actively solicit me for more money to cover the interest payments on the debt they stole in my name. "Mom, you know my policy," I said, keeping my tone perfectly light. "I don't mix family and business. Besides, Julian doesn't need my hoarded wealth, remember? Let his Series B investors bridge the gap." I hung up the phone without waiting for her reply. The noose was tightening. I knew Julian's psychological profile perfectly. He was a narcissist who survived entirely on the perception of his own success. As the walls closed in, he wouldn't go to Gideon. Gideon was tapped out. He wouldn't go to Harper. She was busy falsifying the ledgers and panicking. Julian would come to me. He would view me as the final, desperate lifeline, the wealthy, boring, unsuspecting spinster sister who could be charmed, bullied, or manipulated into writing a check. Exactly 48 hours later, the desperate call came. "Sailor," Julian said, his voice dropping into a register of forced, intimate camaraderie when I answered. "It's Julian. Listen, I know things were a little tense at Christmas. I want to apologize for that. I'd love to take you out for coffee. Just the two of us. I have a massive opportunity I want to run by you." "An opportunity?" I echoed, staring at my reflection in the dark glass of my office window. "A game changer, Sailor. I'm expanding Oraprop's real estate portfolio, and I immediately thought of you. You have a brilliant mind for numbers. I want you on the inside." "All right, Julian. I have an hour tomorrow at 2 p.m., the private lounge at the Soho House in the West Loop." "Perfect," he said, the relief in his voice so palpable it was almost pathetic. "See you then." The Soho House is a highly exclusive members-only club. It is designed for privacy, filled with plush velvet armchairs, dim lighting, and the quiet murmur of people making millions of dollars. It was the perfect stage for an execution. I arrived 10 minutes early. I wore a tailored, charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, a subtle but undeniable uniform of absolute corporate dominance. I sat in a high-back leather chair in a secluded corner, ordering an Earl Grey tea. I reached into the breast pocket of my blazer, pressed a button on a micro-recording device, and settled in to wait. Julian arrived precisely at 2 p.m. The physical deterioration of the man was staggering. The slick, arrogant tech bro from Christmas Eve was gone. He was wearing his usual expensive bespoke suit, but it hung slightly loose on his frame, as if he had dropped 10 pounds in 2 weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark, bruised circles of pure sleep deprivation. The manicured hands that had confidently held a glass of expensive wine just weeks ago were now subtly, uncontrollably trembling. He slid into the velvet chair across from me, signaling a waiter for a double espresso. "Sailor," Julian said, flashing that $1,000,000 smile. It looked like a grimace on his exhausted face. You look incredible. City life suits you. Let's skip the small talk, Julian, I said, resting my hands on the mahogany table. You look like you haven't slept since December. My mother called me, panicking about a liquidity bottleneck. Now you're here pitching me an opportunity. How much money do you need? Julian blinked, clearly thrown by my directness. He was used to dealing with my parents, who worshipped his every word. He wasn't used to being dissected. He leaned forward, dropping his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. Okay, I appreciate the bluntness. You're a businesswoman. I'll give it to you straight. We are in the final stages of closing a $30 million Series B round. It's a lock. But because of some aggressive expansion tactics, we have a short-term cash flow gap, a bridge requirement. I need $500,000 to cover operational overhead for the next 45 days. $500,000. He needed enough cash to pay Victor Sterling's exorbitant interest, pay off the angry minor investors, and keep Harper dripping in designer clothes while he desperately tried to find a new mark. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the bitter bergamot. $500,000 is a significant bridge, Julian. Show me your valuation. Show me your current ARR, your customer acquisition cost, and your proprietary algorithms. If I'm investing $500,000, I need to see the ledger. A bead of cold sweat broke out on Julian's forehead. The absolute last thing a Ponzi scheme operator can do is show a forensic accountant their ledger. Sailor, you know how startups work, Julian chuckled nervously, wiping his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. The tech is highly classified right now, non-disclosure agreements. I can't just hand over the raw data, but I am offering you a guaranteed 20% return in 60 days. That's $100,000 in pure profit just for bridging the gap. I don't do blind investments, I said, my voice dropping to a cool, dismissive register. If you can't show me the books, the answer is no. Ask your current investors for a capital call, or go to a bank. Julian's facade finally, violently shattered. The charming tech CEO vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. He leaned across the table, his bloodshot eyes locking onto mine, his voice dropping from a pitch to a venomous threat. You don't want to say no to me, sailor, Julian hissed, the trembling in his hands worsening. Is that a threat, Julian? I asked calmly, ensuring the microphone in my pocket caught every single syllable of his desperation. It's a reality check, he sneered, his true malicious nature bleeding through the cracks. You think you're so smart, sitting up here in your ivory tower judging my family, judging Harper, but you are already in bed with my company, sailor. You just don't realize how deeply. I widened my eyes slightly, feigning a perfect, convincing shock. What on earth are you talking about? Julian looked around the quiet lounge, ensuring no one was listening, before leaning in even closer. He was so arrogant, so utterly confident in his ability to manipulate the situation, that he willingly walked right into the legal trap I had set. 14 months ago, Aura Prop Innovations secured a $2 million commercial loan from a private equity firm called Sterling Holdings, Julian whispered, his voice dripping with malicious triumph. We needed collateral. Gideon stepped up. He provided the deed to the colonial house in the suburbs. The house is in a family trust, I countered, playing my part perfectly. He can't use it as collateral. He pulled it out of the trust, sailor. Julian smiled, a cruel, ugly smile. He put it back in your name, and then he signed a general power of attorney granting him the right to act as your legal proxy. He signed your name to a $2 million guarantee. Your signature is on the dotted line. You are the primary guarantor of my company's debt. I let a look of manufactured horror wash over my face. I let my breath hitch. I allowed Julian to taste the victory, to believe that his extortion was working. You forged my signature? I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. You and my father committed fraud? Gideon did what he had to do to protect this family's future. Julian deflected, completely throwing my father under the bus to save himself. The point is, sailor, the paperwork is filed. It's legally binding. If I default on that loan, Victor Sterling doesn't just take the house. He comes after you. He seizes your penthouse. He freezes your corporate accounts. He destroys your spotless reputation. Julian leaned back in his velvet chair, looking incredibly satisfied. He thought he held the ultimate trump card. He thought he had just checkmated me. "So here is your new reality, sailor," Julian said, his voice regaining a fraction of its former slick confidence. "You are going to wire me $500,000 by Friday morning. We will call it a bridge loan. I will use it to stabilize the company, and in 60 days I will pay off Sterling, and you will get your house back free and clear. You save your own skin, and you save your parents from a federal fraud investigation. Everybody wins." I sat perfectly still. Inside my pocket, the micro recorder was silently capturing the absolute, undeniable proof of a federal conspiracy, extortion, and wire fraud. Julian had just handed me the physical evidence that would put him and my family in a federal penitentiary. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my tea in his face. I simply looked at the sweating, pathetic man sitting across from me. I slowly reached out, picked up my teacup, and took a final, unhurried sip. I placed the cup delicately back onto the porcelain saucer. The clink of the china was the only sound in our quiet corner. "You really think you're the smartest person in the room, don't you, Julian?" I asked, my voice no longer trembling. The manufactured fear vanished entirely, replaced by the terrifying, clinical coldness of the forensic auditor. Julian frowned, the triumphant smile faltering on his lips. "I'm the guy holding the gun, sailor. You don't have a choice." "I always have a choice," I replied, standing up from the velvet chair. I buttoned my tailored blazer, looking down at him with a gaze so utterly devoid of empathy that he physically shrank back into his seat. "I'm going to think about your generous offer, Julian. I'll let you know my decision." "Friday morning, sailor," Julian hissed, panic flaring in his eyes as I turned to walk away. "If the wire isn't in my account by Friday, we all go down." "Oh, Julian." I paused, glancing back over my shoulder. The predator's smile finally broke across my face, cold and lethal. "I wouldn't worry about Victor Sterling if I were you. He's really not your biggest problem anymore." Then I walked out of the Soho house, leaving him sweating and hyperventilating over his espresso. I didn't wait until Friday. I didn't need to. The execution was already scheduled, and the guest of honor was about to host his own firing squad. My parents were throwing a massive black-tie New Year's Eve gala at the suburban house. It was a desperate final attempt to project extreme wealth to lure in a new batch of unsuspecting investors to bail Julian out before the Sterling loan defaulted. They had ordered imported caviar, a live string quartet, and thousands of dollars in champagne, all paid for with the stolen credit cards and the final drops of the Ponzi money. They had also, in their infinite arrogance, demanded that I attend. They needed their successful corporate daughter there to act as a prop, a shiny piece of background dressing to lend credibility to Julian's fraudulent empire. I wouldn't just attend their party. I was going to be the main event. I drove back to my penthouse, connected my micro recorder to my secure workstation, and extracted the audio file of Julian's extortion. I placed it in a digital folder alongside the forged power of attorney, the forensic analysis of Harper's traced handwriting, the fraudulent tax returns, and the official foreclosure notice bearing the name of Acheron Financial, LLC. The trap had successfully snapped shut. Julian and my family were entirely locked inside the steel jaws of their own greed. They had zero liquidity, a massive balloon payment looming, and they had just handed the only person capable of saving them the legal authority to destroy them. I opened my closet and bypassed my dark, conservative corporate suits. I pulled out a breathtaking, floor-length emerald green designer gown. If I was going to burn my family's fake empire to the ground, I was going to do it looking like absolute royalty. The countdown to midnight had officially begun. There is a distinct metallic scent to a financial hemorrhage. It smells like adrenaline, expensive cologne, and sheer, unadulterated panic. On the evening of December 31st, the Chicago air was dangerously cold, the kind of sub-zero temperature that freezes the moisture in your lungs. I sat in the back of a hired black town car watching the sprawling, snow-covered estates of the affluent suburbs glide past the tinted windows. I wasn't wearing my usual severe corporate armor tonight. I wore a floor-length, backless, emerald green designer gown that draped over my frame like liquid glass. My hair was swept up in an elegant, sharp twist, and my makeup was flawless, cold, and striking. I didn't look like a forensic accountant. I looked like the executioner my family had meticulously built me to be. Beside me, on the leather seat, sat a slim, black leather portfolio. Inside it was the detonator, The emergency ex parte asset freeze injunction signed by a civil court judge just 4 hours prior, the foreclosure notice from Acheron Financial LLC, and a stack of irrefutable, damning forensic audits proving the existence of Oraprop Innovations' multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. My phone buzzed in my clutch. It was a text from Elias Thorne. The sheriff's deputies are staged 2 blocks away. Sterling's legal team is with them. We are holding until your signal. Happy New Year, sailor. I smiled, a thin, sharp line in the dim light of the car. I replied with a single word. Understood. The town car pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the colonial house. The property I had purchased with my own blood, sweat, and thousands of hours of corporate auditing was ablaze with light. My parents had spared absolutely no expense for their final, desperate illusion. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. Valets in white coats were rushing back and forth in the freezing cold. Through the massive front windows, I could see the glittering crystal chandeliers and the silhouetted movement of dozens of wealthy, unsuspecting guests. These were Julian's marks, the fresh blood needed to keep the corpse of his startup twitching for another month. I stepped out of the car, my stiletto heels clicking sharply against the salted brick pathway. The heavy mahogany door, the same door Tamsin had shut in my face exactly 1 week ago, was held open by a hired butler. The moment I stepped into the grand foyer, the heat and the noise washed over me. The air was thick with the scent of imported truffles, roasted duck, and vintage champagne. A live classical string quartet was playing in the corner of the living room. Waiters in black ties glided through the crowd with silver trays. Tamsin spotted me almost immediately. She was wearing a deep burgundy velvet dress, a string of pearls around her neck, playing the role of the affluent matriarch to perfection. She excused herself from a group of older investors and practically sprinted toward me, her eyes widening as she took in my appearance. "Sailor!" Tamsin gasped, her fake, sugary smile plastered firmly on her face. "You look stunning. I didn't think you owned anything that wasn't a gray suit." "It's a special occasion, Mom," I said smoothly, handing my wool coat to the butler. "I wouldn't miss tonight for the world." "Well, I'm so glad you decided to be a team player," she whispered, leaning in so the guests wouldn't hear. Her fingers dug slightly into my arm, a subtle, controlling microaggression. "Julian is pitching the Series B expansion tonight. There are doctors, real estate developers, and a few minor tech executives here. Just mingle, smile, and if anyone asks, tell them how brilliantly Julian manages the family portfolio. We need this to go perfectly, sailor." "Oh, it will be unforgettable," I promised her. I walked past her into the main living room, blending seamlessly into the crowd. I accepted a flute of champagne from a passing waiter and positioned myself near the massive stone fireplace. From this vantage point, I had a clear view of the entire board. Gideon was holding court near the grand piano, laughing loudly and slapping a wealthy cardiologist on the back. He looked incredibly pale beneath the flush of expensive scotch. His eyes darted nervously toward the front door every few minutes. He was terrified, projecting confidence to mask the crushing weight of the $2 million shadow loan he thought he still owed to Victor Sterling. Harper was standing near the center of the room, looking like a living, breathing conflict of interest. She wore a backless silver gown that practically blinded anyone looking at her. But the true centerpiece was the massive, flawless diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. I looked at those diamonds and saw the stolen equity of my house. She was wearing the federal evidence of her wire fraud around her neck, completely oblivious to the radioactive nature of her own jewelry. And then there was Julian. He was sweating. Despite the immaculate tailoring of his bespoke suit, he looked like a man standing on a trapdoor with the rope already around his neck. He was moving frantically from group to group, aggressively pitching, laughing a little too hard, his eyes wide and manic. He was desperate to secure a wire transfer. Any wire transfer, before the banks opened on Monday. I watched them all play their parts. I felt no pity. I felt no hesitation. They were parasites, and I was the cure. At 11:30 p.m., the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Julian tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the ambient chatter of the room. The dozens of wealthy guests turned their attention to the grand staircase, where Julian had positioned himself on the third step, looking down at his audience. Gideon and Tamsin flanked the bottom of the stairs, looking up at him with manufactured awe. Harper stood just to his left, resting her hand on his arm, the perfect, supportive billionaire's wife. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice booming with practiced, charismatic resonance. Friends, family, and esteemed colleagues, as we prepare to ring in the new year, I want to take a moment to reflect on the incredible journey of Oraprop Innovations. A polite murmur of applause rippled through the room. I set my champagne glass down on the mantel. I opened my black leather clutch and pulled out my smartphone. Earlier that afternoon, using the administrative access I had breached in Julian's investor portal, I had downloaded the personal email addresses and phone numbers of every single active and prospective investor on Oraprop's list. I had drafted a mass, encrypted email. Attached to it was a meticulously redacted 50-page forensic dossier. It contained the true bank balances showing zero liquidity, the fraudulent tax returns, the proof of the Ponzi structure, and a clear, undeniable warning that the company was under active civil foreclosure. "We are standing on the precipice of a real estate revolution," Julian continued, spreading his arms wide, his voice rising in an orchestrated crescendo. "Our proprietary AI algorithms are yielding unprecedented, guaranteed returns. Tonight, we are opening the final, exclusive window for our Series B funding round. For those of you who wire your commitments tonight, you aren't just investing in a company. You are securing your legacy." And I looked at the digital clock on my phone screen. 11:35 p.m. I unlocked the screen, navigated to the drafted email, and let my thumb hover over the send icon. "So, please," Julian smiled, raising his glass high into the air, "raise your glasses with me, to the future, to unprecedented wealth, to Oraprop Innovations." "To Oraprop!" The crowd echoed blindly, raising their crystal flutes. I pressed send. It didn't happen all at once. The delivery of a mass email with a heavy PDF attachment takes a few seconds to route through the servers. For 3 excruciatingly long seconds, the room was filled with the sounds of clinking glass and cheerful laughter. And then, the digital firing squad began. Ping! A sharp notification chimed from the pocket of the cardiologist standing near Gideon. Ding! Buzz! Ping! 3 more phones went off simultaneously on the other side of the room. Within 10 seconds, a cacophony of custom ringtones, vibrations, and text alerts flooded the elegant living room. It was an unnatural, disruptive wave of noise. Dozens of investors lowered their champagne glasses, pulling their smartphones from their tuxedo pockets and designer evening bags. Julian's smile faltered slightly on the staircase. "Looks like we have some popular people in the room tonight," he joked, trying to recover the momentum. Nobody laughed. I watched the exact moment the realization hit. I watched the cardiologist open the PDF. I saw his brow furrow in confusion, his eyes darting rapidly back and forth as he read the bold, highlighted text on the first page. Forensic audit, insolvency, and Ponzi structure confirmed. "What the hell is this?" a real estate developer muttered loudly, staring at his screen. "Julian!" an older woman in a sequined dress said, her voice cutting through the sudden, tense silence. Her hands were shaking. "This email... It says Oraprop has 0 liquid capital. It says the returns are being paid out of the principal of new investors. It says you are defaulting on a $2 million shadow loan." Julian's face went completely, terrifyingly blank. The blood rushed from his cheeks, leaving him the color of ash. He stared down at the crowd, his charismatic mask shattering into a million irreparable pieces. That's a cyber attack," Julian stammered, his voice cracking, the smooth baritone entirely gone. "It's a malicious smear campaign by a competitor. Nobody look at that document. It's a phishing scam. Delete it immediately." "It has the actual routing numbers of your corporate accounts, Julian," the cardiologist roared, stepping forward, his face turning a furious, mottled red. "It has the internal wire transfer logs. You took my $300,000 and used it to pay a private equity firm. You lied to us." The room erupted. It was a spectacular, violent shift in psychology. The polite, affluent crowd of elites instantly transformed into a furious, panicked mob. People were shouting, shoving past each other, holding their phones up like weapons. Harper gasped, stumbling backward up the stairs, clutching her diamond necklace as if the crowd was about to rip it from her throat. Gideon rushed forward, waving his hands frantically. "Everyone! Please, calm down. You are in my home. Julian is a genius. This is just a misunderstanding. We can explain everything." "Explain this, Gideon," a man yelled, shoving his phone directly into my father's face. "It says the deed to this very house was forged to secure a fraudulent loan. You're both going to federal prison." Total, absolute chaos. Julian was hyperventilating on the stairs, frozen in pure terror. Tamsin was shrieking, trying to physically block angry investors from approaching her golden son-in-law. I calmly picked up my black leather portfolio from the mantel. I walked deliberately through the screaming crowd. I didn't rush. I parted the sea of panicked elites with the sheer, undeniable gravity of my presence. I stopped at the base of the grand staircase, looking up at the pathetic, crumbling ruins of my family. "Julian," I said. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The absolute freezing calmness in my voice acted like a tuning fork in the chaotic room. The investors nearest to me stopped shouting, turning to look at the woman in the emerald gown. Julian looked down at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and filled with a sudden, horrifying realization. "Sailor," Julian whispered, his hands trembling violently. "What did you do?" "I audited you," I replied smoothly. I unzipped the black leather portfolio. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound with a heavy brass clip. I didn't hand them to Julian. I slapped them hard onto the polished wooden banister, the loud smack echoing over the dying murmurs of the crowd. "What is that?" Gideon demanded, pushing his way to the banister, his chest heaving. "Sailor, have you lost your mind? You sent this email? You're destroying your own family." "I'm executing a civil foreclosure, Dad," I said, my voice projecting clearly so every investor in the room could hear. "That document is a formal notice of default and a writ of attachment." "You can't foreclose on this house," Julian screamed, spit flying from his lips in a total loss of composure. "Victor Sterling holds the paper, not you. You're just a guarantor." I smiled. It was the smile of a predator that had finally closed its jaws around the prey's throat. "Victor Sterling doesn't hold the paper anymore, Julian," I said softly, but the words carried the weight of an anvil. "He sold the debt 3 days ago to a private equity firm called Acheron Financial LLC. I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly across the room. I looked my father dead in the eye. "I am the sole proprietor of Acheron Financial. I bought your debt, Gideon, with cash. I own the commercial deed of trust. I own the fraudulent power of attorney you forged. I own the balloon payments, the default penalties, and the 18% interest rate." Gideon staggered backward, clutching his chest as if he had been physically shot. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing, completely unable to process the magnitude of the checkmate. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he had trapped me. He never considered that I would buy the cage and lock him inside it. "You're bankrupt, Julian." I turned my gaze to my brother-in-law. "Acheron Financial is calling the loan immediately due to covenant breaches and confirmed wire fraud. You owe me $2,400,000 payable immediately. Since you have exactly zero liquidity, I am seizing the collateral." "No!" Harper shrieked, sprinting down the stairs. She lunged at me, but I stepped back, letting her stumble awkwardly in her heels. "You can't do this. You're my sister. You're supposed to protect us. You have millions of dollars, Sailor. You can't just take our house." "It was never your house, Harper," I said, my eyes dropping to the diamonds around her neck. "And considering you were the one who traced my signature on the power of attorney, which I have documented proof of, I suggest you save your tears for the federal judge." Harper froze, the color completely draining from her face. She let out a high-pitched, terrifying wail, realizing she was going to federal prison. Before Tamsin could even begin her inevitable performance, the heavy mahogany front doors of the house were violently thrown open. The freezing winter wind blasted into the grand foyer, extinguishing the decorative candles and sending a chill through the entire crowd. The cavalry had arrived. Elias Thorne walked through the door, looking immaculate in a heavy cashmere overcoat. But he wasn't alone. Flanking him were 4 uniformed sheriff's deputies, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. And right behind them, stepping into the opulent foyer with a look of pure, unadulterated malice, was Victor Sterling. Victor was a massive, intimidating man who radiated financial violence. He had come personally to oversee the physical execution of the seizure, furious that Julian had tried to play him, and thoroughly impressed by the utter ruthlessness of my trap. "Julian Hayes! Gideon Mercer!" the lead sheriff's deputy announced, his voice booming with legal authority. "By order of the Civil Court of Cook County, this property is now under a direct writ of attachment. We have an emergency injunction to freeze all physical and digital assets on these premises due to confirmed financial fraud. The room dissolved into absolute pandemonium. The investors, realizing the house was being seized and their money was truly gone, began screaming at the deputies, demanding arrests. Victor Sterling ignored the crowd. He walked straight through the foyer, his heavy boots echoing on the marble, stopping right in front of the staircase. He looked up at Julian, who was literally cowering behind the banister. "You thought you could run a Ponzi scheme on my money, Hayes?" Victor growled, a terrifying low rumble. "You thought you could burn my capital to buy your wife diamonds? Ms. Mercer bought your debt, which means I don't get to skin you in civil court, but I came here tonight to personally watch you lose everything." Victor turned to the deputies. "Secure the premises. Nobody leaves with a single asset that belongs to the estate." "This is a mistake!" Tamsin suddenly shrieked. It was time for her final desperate play. She clutched her chest, her eyes rolling back into her head, and she collapsed dramatically onto the hardwood floor in a heap of burgundy velvet. "My heart! Gideon, my heart is failing! I'm dying!" "Mom!" Harper screamed, dropping to her knees next to her. "Somebody call an ambulance! Sailor, look what you've done! You're killing her!" The crowd parted slightly, a few people murmuring in shock. Gideon dropped to his knees, completely panicked. I didn't flinch. I didn't rush to her side. I looked at Elias, who gave a brief, subtle nod. "Deputy," I said calmly, addressing the lead officer, "my mother has a history of severe histrionic panic attacks when faced with accountability. But just to be safe, could you have your staging EMTs come inside? I wouldn't want her to miss the reading of the seizure notice." Two paramedics who had been staged outside with the police cruisers walked briskly into the room with a medical bag. They knelt beside Tamsin, who was panting heavily, eyes squeezed shut. The EMT quickly strapped a blood pressure cuff to her arm and placed a pulse oximeter on her finger. 10 seconds later, the EMT looked up, his expression completely flat. "Her vitals are absolutely perfect," the paramedic announced loudly. "Heart rate is slightly elevated from stress, but she is in zero medical distress. Ma'am, you can open your eyes now." A collective gasp of disgust rippled through the remaining investors. Tamsin's eyes snapped open. She realized her ultimate manipulation, her trump card of playing the dying victim, had been publicly, clinically dismantled in front of the elite society she worshipped. She lay on the floor, that absolute picture of pathetic humiliation. "Get up, Mom," I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. "The floor is cold and you no longer own it." Gideon, defeated, broken, and stripped of all his arrogant vanity, slowly helped Tamsin to her feet. They stood at the bottom of the stairs, surrounded by angry investors, sheriff's deputies, and the terrifying presence of Victor Sterling. Julian was slumped on the staircase, his head in his hands, weeping openly. The tech visionary was gone. He was just a terrified con artist waiting for the federal indictments to drop. Elias Thorne stepped forward, handing a thick stack of eviction and asset seizure notices to the lead deputy. "Mr. Mercer, Mr. Hayes," Elias said, his legal baritone cutting through the despair, "you have exactly 1 hour to pack one standard suitcase each of personal clothing. No jewelry, no electronics, no financial documents. Everything else on this property now belongs to Acheron Financial, LLC. If you are not off the premises in 60 minutes, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." I turned away from them. I didn't need to hear their apologies. I didn't need to listen to their weeping. The audit was complete. The accounts were reconciled. I walked toward the front door, the crowd of investors parting silently to let me pass. As I reached the threshold, I stopped and looked back one final time. My father was standing in the ruins of his gala, looking at me with an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. He finally realized that the daughter he had treated like a disposable bank account had just foreclosed on his entire existence. "Sailor," Gideon whispered, a final pathetic plea echoing across the grand foyer. "Where are we supposed to go?" I stood in the doorway, the freezing Chicago wind whipping the skirt of my emerald gown around my legs. "I don't know, Dad," I replied, my voice as cold as the snow falling outside. "But I have some cold leftovers in my fridge. I'll be sure to pack them in a plastic container for you." I stepped out into the night, the heavy mahogany doors closing firmly behind me, leaving them trapped in the nightmare they had built. The justice system is notoriously slow, but when you hand federal prosecutors a perfectly organized, mathematically irrefutable forensic dossier, the wheels of bureaucracy turn with terrifying, brutal efficiency. 6 months passed. The blistering sub-zero cold of that unforgettable Chicago winter melted away, replaced by the heavy, suffocating heat of a Midwestern July. I sat silently in the polished mahogany pews of a federal courthouse downtown, completely removed from the sterile corporate environment of my accounting firm. I wasn't there to testify. My recorded evidence, the forged power of attorney, and the wire transfer logs I had handed over to the SEC and the FBI had done all the heavy lifting. I was simply there as an observer, watching the final curtain fall on the absolute destruction my family had brought upon themselves. The courtroom was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of the court reporter's keyboard. The federal judge, a stern woman with absolutely no patience for white-collar criminals, looked down from her elevated bench. Standing before her, wearing a shapeless, bright orange jumpsuit instead of his bespoke charcoal suits, was Julian Hayes. He looked significantly older. The stress of spending 6 months in a federal holding facility, unable to post the massive bail Victor Sterling's lawyers had aggressively lobbied against, had stripped away every ounce of his magnetic charm. His hair was thinning, his posture was slumped, and his eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for a lifeline that no longer existed. The judge did not mince words. She detailed the absolute devastation Julian had caused, outlining the millions of dollars stolen from hardworking retirement accounts and the brazen arrogance of his Ponzi structure. When she finally handed down the sentence, her voice was like a heavy iron gavel. Julian Hayes received 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for securities fraud, wire fraud, and extortion, without the possibility of early parole. He flinched, his shoulders collapsing entirely as the federal marshal stepped forward to escort him away. He didn't look back at the gallery. He didn't look at his wife. He just shuffled through the side door, a ghost of the billionaire he pretended to be. Next came Harper. My sister stood at the defense table wearing a drab, ill-fitting gray pantsuit provided by her court-appointed attorney. She had tried her absolute best to play the innocent, betrayed wife throughout the legal process. She had wept in depositions claiming Julian had manipulated her, that she didn't understand the complex financial ledger she was managing. But federal judges are not manipulated by theatrical tears. The prosecutors had displayed the emails I provided. The exact emails where Harper enthusiastically detailed tracing my signature from childhood documents to secure the fraudulent commercial loan. The forensic handwriting analysis was undeniable. When the judge addressed her, Harper instantly began to sob, deploying the same wide-eyed, victimized expression she had used her entire life to get out of trouble with our parents. It didn't work. The judge reprimanded Harper for her profound greed, her active participation in the fraud syndicate, and her malicious willingness to destroy her own sister's life for designer clothes. She was sentenced to 5 years in a minimum security federal prison. As the bailiff approached to handcuff her, Harper turned wildly toward the gallery, her tear-streaked face searching frantically for our parents to save her. But Gideon and Tamsin just sat there, hollow and broken, unable to shield their golden child from the consequences of the real world. Harper was led out, her cries echoing briefly before the heavy wood slammed shut. Sitting 2 rows ahead of me in the gallery were my parents. Gideon and Tamsin had managed to avoid federal prison sentences by doing what narcissists always do when cornered. They cut a desperate plea deal. They willingly testified against Julian, threw their own daughter under the bus, and claimed extreme financial duress to avoid jail time. But their physical freedom came at an astronomical, apocalyptic cost. They were completely and permanently ruined. Following the New Year's Eve gala, Acheron Financial, my company, had legally seized the suburban colonial house and entirely liquidated its contents to cover the defaulted shadow loan. My parents were forced into absolute, unmitigated bankruptcy. Their credit scores were completely annihilated. Their bank accounts were frozen and drained to pay restitution to the minor investors Julian had defrauded. They had gone from country club elites to destitute outcasts overnight. They were currently living in a cramped, foul-smelling, weekly rate motel on the industrial outskirts of the city, surviving solely on their meager Social Security checks. The proceedings concluded, and the gallery began to empty. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer, and walked out into the bright marble hallway of the courthouse. I was heading toward the elevators, ready to return to my firm, when I heard frantic, shuffling footsteps behind me. "Sailor! Wait, please, Sailor, wait a minute!" I stopped and turned around. Tamsin was practically running toward me. The physical deterioration of my mother was genuinely shocking. She looked incredibly frail, having aged 10 years in 6 months. Her expensive highlights had faded into harsh gray roots. The designer velvet dresses were gone, replaced by a faded, wrinkled cardigan and cheap slacks. She stopped a few feet away from me, panting heavily, her eyes completely bloodshot and desperate. "Sailor, I am so glad I caught you, Tamsin said, her voice trembling with a pathetic, grating whine. We have absolutely nothing left. The motel rent took our entire check this month. Your father hasn't eaten a hot meal in 2 days. He's sick, Sailor. We are starving. I know we made terrible mistakes, but please, I just need a small loan. Just $100 for some basic groceries. You are my daughter. You have millions. You can't just let us starve in the streets. She reached out her trembling hand, expecting me, for the final time, to dispense cash out of biological guilt. She expected the trauma bond to hold. I looked at her outstretched hand, feeling absolutely no pity. I felt nothing but the sterile satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. You're right, Mom, I said smoothly, my voice echoing slightly in the marble hallway. You do rely on Social Security. But I imagine it's very difficult to buy groceries when your bank accounts are completely frozen under a federal anti-money laundering hold. Tamsin blinked, her hand slowly dropping to her side. The desperate, pleading look on her face morphed into confusion, and then, slowly, into a creeping, icy terror. How did you know my bank account was frozen? Because I'm a forensic accountant, I replied, taking a slow step toward her. When I audited Julian's company, I audited everything, including the secondary credit card you secretly opened under my name 12 years ago, the one you kept hidden, having the statements routed to a P.O. box, using it to buy your luxury groceries and salon treatments while pretending you were living on a strict budget. Tamsin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked like she had just been struck by lightning. You used my stolen credit card to buy the groceries for that beautiful Christmas dinner last year, I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. You bought the prime rib, you bought the expensive wine, and you bought the ham. When the FBI investigation started, I officially reported that specific card to the IRS and the credit bureaus for identity theft and sustained fraud. I watched the realization hit her. Since you had tied that illicit card to your personal banking profile to pay the minimum balances, I explained clinically, the fraud investigation triggered an automatic, mandatory freeze on your primary accounts under federal protocols. The government locked your Social Security deposits pending a prolonged investigation into your financial crimes. I didn't just take your house, Mom. I cut your final, hidden lifeline. Tamsin let out a hollow, devastated gasp. She staggered backward, leaning heavily against the marble wall of the courthouse. She realized that her own petty, persistent theft, the very card she used to buy the food she had denied me, was the exact instrument of her starvation. I calmly reached into my designer leather tote bag. I didn't pull out my wallet. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I pulled out a cheap, flimsy plastic container. It was the exact same Tupperware she had shoved into my hands on Christmas Eve. It was warped, the lid slightly askew, but this time it was completely empty. I stepped forward and placed the empty plastic container directly into her trembling hands. Merry Christmas, Mom, I whispered. I turned my back and walked onto the elevator, leaving her alone in the hallway. The heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of my mother standing in the courthouse with her empty plastic container. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, I felt a physical weight lift from my shoulders. A burden I had carried for 42 years simply evaporated into thin air. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, stepped into my waiting car, and drove forward into a life that was finally entirely mine. Fast forward 1 year, it was Christmas Eve again, but the freezing Chicago snow falling outside my floor-to-ceiling windows felt beautiful rather than bitter. I stood in the center of my penthouse, the warm glow of the stone fireplace reflecting off the pristine glass overlooking the skyline. The air was filled with the rich, savory scent of roasted duck, garlic herbs, and fresh pine from the towering tree in the corner. But the most beautiful part of the evening wasn't the luxury of the apartment or the expensive decorations. It was the sound. My home was filled with loud, genuine, joyous laughter. There were no tense whispers, no performative displays of fake wealth, no passive-aggressive insults masked as advice, and absolutely no conditional love. I walked into the dining room carrying a tray of warm appetizers and smiled at the people gathered around my custom-made oak dining table. These were the people who respected my mind, honored my boundaries, and stood by me when I burned an empire to the ground. Sitting at the head of the table was Elias Thorne, swirling a glass of expensive red wine, telling a brilliant, dryly humorous story about a recent corporate deposition. Next to him was my lead auditing team, brilliant analysts who were fiercely loyal. Across the table were close friends I had made outside of the toxic bubble of my childhood, people who celebrated my victories without an ounce of jealousy. There were 12 people in my home tonight. They were completely relaxed, safe, and genuinely happy to be there. I set the tray down on the massive table. It was overflowing with incredible food, set with heavy ceramic plates, crystal glasses, and proper silverware. There were no flimsy plastic tubs of leftovers tonight. There was an abundance of warmth, an abundance of food, and most importantly, an abundance of space. For so long, I had believed that family was strictly defined by biology. I thought that because we shared the same blood, I owed them my loyalty, my resources, and my endless, unconditional forgiveness. I thought I had to endure their cruelty and their manipulation just to keep my seat at their table, even if that seat was out in the freezing snow. But the truth is, toxic family members rely entirely on that biological guilt to keep you trapped in their cycle of abuse. They expect you to absorb their poison and blindly call it love. They weaponize the word family to turn you into a reliable resource, extracting your time, your money, and your emotional energy while offering nothing but criticism in return. In my profession, I audit corporations to find the rotting, fraudulent core that threatens to bring down the whole structure. But I had to learn the hardest auditing lesson of all on myself. You cannot heal a body while a cancer is actively destroying it from the inside out. You have to be brave enough to cut the disease parts out completely, even if it hurts. Even if society tells you that you are ruthless or cold, because once the toxicity is gone, the body can finally recover. Once I cut my parents and my sister out of my life, the constant anxiety, the self-doubt, and the desperate, pathetic need for their validation vanished. I was left with a beautiful, peaceful space to build the life I actually deserved. I picked up my glass of champagne and gently tapped it with a silver spoon. The ringing sound caught the attention of the room, and the laughter settled into a warm, attentive silence. My chosen family turned to look at me, their faces reflecting genuine respect and love. "I just want to thank all of you for being here tonight," I said, my voice steady, full of an immense, profound gratitude. "You have shown me what real support looks like. You celebrate my success without asking for a cut. You stand by me through the chaos without asking for a price tag. Let us raise a glass to the family we choose, to loyalty, to truth, and to never settling for leftovers." We all raised our glasses toward the center of the table. "Merry Christmas, everyone," I said, smiling warmly. "I am so glad you're here, because at this table, there is always more than enough room for you." Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end. Have you ever had to make the incredibly difficult decision to walk away from toxic family members and build your own chosen family? How did you finally find the strength to cut them out and protect your own peace? I would absolutely love to hear your experiences and read your stories in the comments below. If Sailor's journey resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who might need the courage to leave a toxic table behind. Your worth is never determined by the people who refuse to see it. Remember, you hold the pen, and you always have the power to write your own ending.